In today's video, I'm going to be having a look and a review of the Australian dollar. I'm also going to be looking at earnings season and which companies are going to be out this week. As well as all that, I'm giving you my watch list for the week ahead. Hello and welcome to another ACY Securities Market Review. My name is Alistair Schultz and I'm going to be a host through today's trading journey. The first thing I'm looking at today is a chart, as always, of what's gone on in the past week and what pieces of news or events that have come up have truly impacted price the most. Today's chart is an Aussie dollar 1 hour chart for those of you at home who might want to follow along. Now, I have marked out on this chart all the way along all the different news pieces that have occurred and when they've actually happened, obviously in relation to where price is. Now, what I've seen in this week has been a mix of data coming from either European side of data, we've also got the US stuff when it all comes mixed together with COVID-19, particularly with interest in Florida, Texas, Spain, and a number of little countries such as we're seeing in the Philippines. Now, the big ones for me, though, that I've seen other than stimulus talk has actually been what's been coming from the RBA. And you can see the impact that it's had on price. Immediately after the RBA announcement, we saw about 120 pips on the rise up for the Aussie dollar. Now, obviously, in the second half of the week, we did have a bank holiday on Thursday and Friday for Japan. So we did see a little bit of subdued action really happening. Not as much money in the market, so that would lead to that sort of behavior that we've seen here where price has been a little bit choppy towards the end of the week. Now, moving on from that, I am going to talk a little bit more about what's been going on at the RBA. This week, the Reserve Bank of Australia did release a statement. We also had Governor Lowe talking. One of the interesting points that I noticed was what the media actually reported on this. We saw a number of different headlines that came up, and it basically said, from the tweet that you can see just next to Governor Lowe's head there, that said, RBA Gov Lowe says coronavirus lockdown in Melbourne is very concerning. Now, that was only one of them. And so it was pushing this idea of what the problem was around the globe. But there are other things that were said as well. One of the other headlines that we saw was that the RBA is considering cutting 10 basis points. That's not actually what happened, and that's not what was said. And if you read through the statement or the Governor Lowe's statement that he did say, you would see the quote that I've got behind me, and it says, we've got the cash rate at 25 basis points, or 0.25% for those of you at home, and it's the lowest on record. And I think effectively that's the lowest that we can go. So we've already seen that he said that whilst we could have gone lower, in what he was making was a comparison to what happened in the weeks beforehand and what had happened with other central banks around the globe, saying that when we did drop it down to 25 basis points, that we potentially could have gone about 10 lower, but at this point in time, he's not seeing any good reason for it. Now, having said all of this, there could potentially still be a chance for that to actually happen. The concerns that we're seeing from the RBA are really driven by inflation. And now looking at this weakness that we're seeing on the US dollar side of things, it's really helping drive the Australian dollar up. Naturally, iron ore is helping, but the US's COVID-19 situation is driving that weakness against the Australian dollar. The difference in yields between the Australian bonds and the US treasuries is also getting wider and wider, indicating that there is potentially a probability of being able to do a carry trade if you are likely or feeling like taking the risk on that front. Now, as I've said before, with the RBA having some concern on inflation and trying to get those numbers up right now, the expectation is it's going to be remaining low for an extended period of time. And this has all been related to what's happening in Victoria, but also New South Wales. We've seen, obviously, rising coronavirus cases, and both New South Wales and Victoria are really the largest contributors towards GDP in Australia. So, if we have the permanent lockdown sort of happening here in Victoria, and it was to follow through into New South Wales and a number of other member states, then we are likely going to run into a few problems. Now, this week we do have the consumer price inflation report due out on Wednesday, and the next RBA meeting is in August. Now, regardless of that factor, I am inclined to think that we will likely see him be a little bit more dovish at the next meeting, and he might indicate that he will potentially lower rates a little bit further. The reasoning behind all this is obviously, whilst we do have a fundamentally strong situation for the zone here in Australia and the economy as a whole, there are areas of concern. The labour market is definitely one of them, and of course, we have to consider the COVID impact. So, all of those together and the consumer spending really degrade the value or the ability of inflation to be at a target level of between 2 and 3%. And at the moment, it is just not there. So he's going to be trying to combat that over the coming weeks, obviously using monetary policy to the best of his ability. He has also said that it's likely that monetary policy and fiscal policy is to remain for some time to come. Now, having a look just with a little bit of a virus update for you all today, we have more than 16 million cases around the globe. They are not all active though. A lot of these people have recovered. And at this point in time, we have 647,000 deaths. So these numbers are going to continue to rise for some time to come. We have heard about some of the vaccine opportunities that are around the corner, but we still don't have enough testing to say that they are actually going to work. And I believe at the moment we are seeing a lot of people investing on the rumor and selling on the data. So it's a good idea to keep an eye on what happens around that front. Now, moving on to earnings season. We are entering another week of earnings season. This week, we're expecting to see reports from Apple, Amazon, Alphabet, Chevron, Rio Tinto, L'Oreal, Caterpillar, Samsung, Barclays, and Credit Suisse. My focus for earnings season is really going to be on Rio Tinto because I feel that they will likely have had quite a good pickup in growth and a fairly good revenue year considering the prices of iron ore. Now, naturally, we all know what's happening with Amazon. They have had tremendous profits, but it's probably a little bit late on the action there to try and get into a longer term position or at least trying to see more growth from them. But nonetheless, definitely worth keeping an eye on. Same as Apple with that front, though we do know that with some of the factory shutdowns that Apple had earlier on in the year, that they are likely going to have some issues around that. And they've also delayed the release of their new iPhone. So that will obviously impact their revenue capabilities coming up. Now, moving on for what my watch list is for the rest of this week, I am going to be watching that CPI or the consumer price inflation very, very closely because I believe it will indicate what we might see from the RBA in the next few weeks. Now, from there, we've also got a US FOMC press conference later on in the week. We have German preliminary GDP, which will be important, and US second quarter GDP. So this one could be a bit of an interesting week, particularly because next week we also run into NFP coming along. So keep an eye on some of these things. We've got the Chinese manufacturing PMI, that is on the bottom of my radar, but nonetheless, the rest of them are all quite important. If there's anything from today's video you'd like to get in contact with me about, then please feel free to shoot me an email at talktoal@acy.com. And of course, don't forget to like and subscribe so you can get more great content from me and ACY Securities in the future. Have a great trading day ahead.